Following an altercation with the police, the then 22-year-old William Gaddis was asked to leave Harvard. From this point on, Gaddis would spend the next decade living a nomadic lifestyle, voyaging around the American Southwest, Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Spain, France, Italy, the UK, and North Africa. This Gaddis is a wanderer, a truant, a reader, a devotee of moral philosophy, a worker on the Panama Canal, a Parisian bohemian, a Catherine Ann Porter fanboy, and a young man trying to come to terms with what their art could be. It is this period that gives birth to The Recognitions, a novel born from the ashes of the failed project Blague. In this video, I hope to untangle all of these threads and to produce a portrait of William Gaddis between 1947 and 1953 that will help to provide us with a firm grounding in order to tackle the recognitions. As always, this video is a condensed version of a much more thorough article available to all free subscribers on my Substack and Patreon. If you would like to read those, then the links are on my channel page. In my opinion, the most essential moment to understanding how we get to the recognitions is to understand the circumstances surrounding the collapse of the project which preceded it. In a letter to his mother, written from Mexico City on April 7, 1947, Gaddis announces, "But now I am on it, and like it, and believe that it may have a chance. Right now the title is Blague, French for kidding, as it were, but it really is no kidding." Blague, called The Lie with Circumstance, or as it would also be known, As You Lie It, only really exists as a project for this first year of our interest. It collapses almost as soon as it begins, yet it tells us a great deal about what the young Gaddis' major concerns are. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to see the Blague manuscript, as it is kept by the Washington University Library in St. Louis. But there is still plenty that can be learned from how Gaddis discusses the work in his published correspondence. The basic premise of the novel, as it has been explained to me, had two elements. The first, which centred around two drunken friends giving driving lessons in a dual-controlled car, wherein they discussed the nature of good and evil, and the rest of the novel, which would centre on the lives of a number of bohemian characters in New York City. The former part, which I must say exists in my mind as a kind of Gaddis does Jim Jarmusch's Night on Earth, was scrapped entirely and was later derided by Gaddis as pretentious and dishonest in a letter he wrote to the novelist Catherine Ann Porter in 1948. The latter part of Blague survives in some sense in the similar scenes which can be found in The Recognitions and its many banal-seeming New York party scenes. Of particular interest to Gaddis, as he expressed in a letter to one of his old Harvard friends, is that Blague is expressly a novel concerned with morality. He tells us, "It is rather a moral book, and concerns itself with good and evil, or rather, as Mr. Forster taught us, good and evil." In the written version of this issue, I take a closer look at exactly what Gaddis means by evoking the work of E.M. Forster in this instance, but I should do my best to succinctly summarise it here. What Gaddis is referring to here is a distinction made in E.M. Forster's 1907 novel, The Longest Journey, a Bildungsroman akin to Jacob's Room and The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It tells the story of a young Cambridge student navigating the complexities of life in the early 20th century. In referring to The Longest Journey, Gaddis is saying that not only will Blague examine good and evil, but it will seek to interrogate the very structures which propagate the two ideas as existing at all. It is not enough, in the Fosterian ideal, to simply take good and evil as face value concepts, but to understand that they are maintained by a vast network of social structures, schools, churches, states, each with their own implied meanings and agendas. Good and evil are, in this sense, a part of an ideological framework that is stamped onto an individual through the systems they have passed. If we accept this as an interpretation of what Gaddis is saying here, then we have found an element of his thought which will remain present through the entirety of his career. Whether it is the Reverend Guyon in The Recognitions or Edward Bast in J.R., Gaddis's novels centre characters who examine and ultimately reject the systems which they have been conditioned to be a part of. While most critics highlight the Marxist element of the critique present in Gaddis's work, and not entirely without due cause given that American capitalism is often a target, I think it is interesting to consider that this ethical questioning appears to have been at the heart of his work from the very beginning. When Gaddis says in the same letter that he has devoted himself to the work of Epictetus and David Hume, we get a much greater sense of not only his moral project, but the thought he is aligning himself with. Epictetus was a Greek Stoic philosopher, best known for his work The Discourses, in which he built a philosophy of self-reliance, which argued that reason alone was a good, and the irrational was evil, and that it was our duty to engage in battle against the irrational thoughts which lead us to evil. Also key to Epictetus's thought is the idea of volition, an idea which centres man's capacity for choice as the fundamental core of their freedom. The other key figure, Scottish empiricist David Hume, is perhaps too great a topic to cover here in any depth. Simply put, Hume was almost the inverse of Epictetus, believing that it was the sentiment of emotion which drove ethical choices rather than abstract rational principles. What is possibly more significant is that Hume was a hugely controversial figure in his day, a man standing in the maelstrom of the Enlightenment and charting a new radical path for philosophy. There is no doubt this must have had a profound appeal to the young Gaddis, living through the radical aesthetic transformations of his own age. After all, Gaddis insists again and again, "I believe Blague has something to say, if I can write it. If not, believe me, there is little else that interests me." This level of earnestness is a feature that's only present in the Blague period. While he does approach the topic of ethics around the recognitions, he's much more reserved. More than once when discussing the recognitions, he enters a self-deprecating mode and is openly annoyed with what he sees as the maturity which marks the novel out as a first novel. Even if he did deem it important enough to send a copy to Robert Oppenheimer unsolicited. To be so bold as to say that your first novel has something important to say about such weighty topics as good and evil is the kind of ambition and naivety that comes across as quite endearing 80 years later. It humanises Gaddis in a way, to see him full of youthful exuberance, when so much of his public persona is from his later, more mature years. It shows us that even great authors were once young and prone to the same dreams that we all have had. Had Blague been completed, it's impossible to say just how Gaddis's literary life would have developed. What is useful to us, however, is that it directly announces where Gaddis's head is in the formative years of writing the recognitions. It is specifically the failure of Blague which brings life to the recognitions. He predicted the likelihood that Blague would collapse that summer, and it did. In some sense he knew that this story was just a testing ground for something much greater. He just needed to go out and find it. After Blague collapsed in September of 1947, Gaddis hits the road. That year he heads down to Panama in order to pursue a career as an English language journalist. In a turn that might come to remind one of Otto in the recognitions, this fails through down the line and he finds himself living in a rundown apartment, picking bananas for the United Fruit Company's Panamanian subsidiary, the Chiqueri Land Company. Yes, William Gaddis temporarily got himself wrapped up in the banana republics. This, and the subsequent time he spent working on a crane around the Panama Canal, begins to have an effect on Gaddis's relationship to America's cultural colonisation of the world, as he writes to his mother on the 23rd of January 1948. One thing though, to keep away from America, except for New York and Long Island. But America I have such pity for, fury at. Why are Americans so awful? Their voice is everything. You can't imagine Pedro Miguel, what the Americans have done in civilizing the strip called Canal Zone, how they have sterilized it. And why do they feel it incumbent upon them to behave with rudeness everywhere away from home? Barren ignorance is most horrible when it's in power. The picture of the American soldier abroad will never cease to make me shudder. This is the Gaddis probably familiar to people, the Gaddis who sets himself out against certain aspects of American culture. Here, the individual rudeness of Americans and the much broader cultural sterilizing effect of the American economic expansion are what catch his ire. The American, according to Gaddis, is imposing its ignorance onto the world through a rejection of non-American manners and customs and a violent implanting of its own cultural image onto the people of Panama. Panama, at this point in time, was a perfect example of this. The Panama Canal was ultimately a tool by which the US could impose its will onto Latin America. What Gaddis would have seen in Panama in 1947 would have been identical to that which was occurring in Cuba and which ultimately led to the Cuban Revolution of the late 1950s. The cynicism towards the American project, which we see flowering in Gaddis at this stage, runs directly through the rest of his life. That which becomes the central critique of J.R. and Carpenter's Gothic finds its genesis squarely in these observations here. Gaddis leaves Panama. At this point work on the recognitions has begun, and the embryo of the novel exists as 2 chapters in the bottom of his briefcase. After a brief time spent in Costa Rica, he arrives in Europe in 1949, landing in Spain. Spain, a significant locale in the recognitions, captures his imagination. He spent some time in this period living in a monastery, reading among other things the mystic history The Golden Bough. From Spain he begins to move across Europe, and doing so he lives in Parisian apartments and encounters the work of Hieronymus Bosch. He builds connections with England after a chance encounter with the painter John Napper on a beach in Spain. He falls in love not just with England, but with the Nappers, and they maintain a strong friendship throughout this period. This nomadic and restless wandering is how Gaddis would spend the next 2 years of his life, culminating in a journey across North Africa with a copy of Robert Graves's The White Goddess in hand. The Gaddis in this period, through his reading and through his experience, is navigating through the old world on 2 levels. The first being its genuine 20th century material reality, and the second in which it is haunted by its own mystical and spiritual past. This is the conflict which the recognition swims in, yet it could not be completed in Europe. Only after grounding himself back into his native United States and reflecting on these experiences abroad, was Gaddis able to build the novel that would attempt to synthesize everything he had come to know of the world while he was away. Gaddis returns to New York in the second half of 1951. He takes a job writing for American Illustrated and locks himself away in New York's public libraries researching forgeries. I haven't been able to pin down exactly what he was reading at this time, but he is very clear on the subject. This must have been when the notion of forgery really takes hold in the consciousness of the recognitions. Forgery is, for all these mystical or metaphysical or philosophical discussions, the concrete core of the recognitions. It is the element from which all of these other interests are allowed to flow forth. By this point, the production of the novel was a rolling train without brakes. There would be no collapse at this point. The recognitions would not suffer the same fate that Blague had before it. In fact, the novel only grows and grows by the day. In March of 1952, Gaddis complains that the novel was at 100,000 words and had still not been finished. Compared to what the novel ends up being, the 100,000 words represent a novella, and yet he keeps going with no stop in sight. One can only imagine the terror in the heart of the poor editors at New World Writing when they optioned the novel in the December of 1952. When the completed manuscript of the Recognitions was submitted in May 1953, it was a 500,000 word long epic. Gaddis couldn't bring himself to edit it. He thought that a serious dedication to self-editing the work would only make him hate it more and scrap the whole novel entirely. This is perhaps why, after completing the Recognitions, Gaddis tells multiple friends that he had no interest in writing another novel immediately. It is as though something had been drawn out of him, something which must have been there in the original instinct to write, which he had now exercised and from which he had to recover. Whether he necessarily knew that it would be another 20 years before he would write a second novel, that's hard to say, but it's clear that he could not bring himself to wrestle with the ordeal just yet. What I think this period in William Gaddis's life shows us is that we're dealing with an author undaunted by the anxieties that haunt a lot of first-time novelists. He is aware of the potential for his novel projects to collapse and fail, and it doesn't faze him at all. In fact, he seems comfortable to reintegrate the lessons of that failure into the next idea. Blague fails, so he tries again with the Recognitions without much disaster. It is as though the challenges and stumbling blocks he encounters are accepted as part of the natural risk of making art. Blague collapses, he goes and he reads more books and he throws himself out into the world to see if experience and knowledge can guide him towards a more successful attempt the next time. It is often said that writing is an extension of reading, but then one might assume that the Recognitions is an extension of the life around the reading, the imagination drawing the real and the literary together into a novel which is about the old European superstition bleeding into the American capitalist world, and the American cultural creep stretching its claws back into Europe. With the publication of the Recognitions comes the end of our lengthy prologue. I hope that many of you have been able to understand how necessary it is to the project for us to adequately lay the groundwork for the task of reading the novel. Our next issue shall focus on the first chapter of the Recognitions and introduce several key characters we will be spending a great deal of time with. If you have made it this far, I would like to thank you, and to remind you that even more in-depth versions of this issue are available for free on my Substack and Patreon. For anyone who would like to support the channel there is also a 2,000 word bonus essay on the letters William Gaddis sent to the novelist Catherine Ann Porter, available to all £5 and up subscribers. While paying subscribers do help me out a great deal, so does everyone who likes and leaves a comment on the video. I would also like to thank anyone who subscribes to the channel. It helps me out a tremendous deal. I hope to see you again here soon.